Hello again and welcome to the Dorothy L. Sayers podcast. Today, Selah Hurd is joining me again to talk about one of England's iconic writers, Lewis Carroll, and what he has to do with Sayers, or what Sayers has to do with him. So let's get started. I want you to imagine young Dorothy L. Sayers, or as my husband likes to say, Dot Sayers, which there's no evidence anywhere that she was ever called Dot or Dottie. So young Miss Sayers wandering around a house called Choir House in Oxford. She's under 4.5. She's got her very short, boyish haircut or childish haircut in Victorian frock, whatever that is. And Selah here is going to tell us what she found.
Great. Yes. So I'm about to read a quote from My Edwardian Childhood, which is Sayers' autobiography. That is all I remember of the inside of the choir house, except that on one occasion I penetrated into the boys' part of the building with my father for the purpose of borrowing the Alice books. A boy took the 2 red volumes from the bookshelf and slapped the covers together once or twice to expel the dust. From this circumstance, I can safely assert that I knew Alice before I was 4.5. At which age I left the choir house. I possessed my own copies later on, but these were the green edition.
Yeah, so paraphrase that for us. What happened with her?
Yeah, so Sayers, as you said,
Cute little Sayers?
Cute little Sayers, yes. Which is kind of a funny adjective to think of to describe her if you're familiar with her in later life. Yes. But yeah, so she's having this really incredible, awesome childhood encounter with a story that's going to be, pretty firmly in the furniture of her mind, I think is how you described it earlier. She remembers vividly like the color of the books, the dust getting slapped off of them. And yeah, so it's just this really cool encounter with Lewis Carroll.
And you said the book is her memoir, right?
Yes,
autobiography. Yeah. And it's interesting, like around the My Edwardian, like this particular section, she's not talking about Lewis Carroll. She's talking about just memories from her childhood before they moved from Oxford to another location. But she kind of like uses this deduction of, and this is when I must have encountered Alice.
Yeah, so it was important enough for her to put in there along with all those other childhood things.
Exactly. Yeah. It's almost like an interviewer said to her, so tell us about Lewis Carroll's influence on your life. And this is one of her answers. So, and what we're going to find out is that, and what many of you listeners may already know, is that Lewis Carroll had a pretty significant impact on Sayers' imagination, would you say? Or you pointed this out to me a couple of weeks ago. So tell us more about your thought processes on that.
Yeah, so I think definitely imagination is a good way to describe it. She references him throughout. There's a Peter Wimsey story called The Queen's Square, in which people are dressed up as the Red Queen, White Queen. Obviously, it's a direct Lewis Carroll reference because they're dressed up as those characters. And throughout lots of her essays, she'll like casually allude to the story just like she would to like Song of Roland or any other story that she thinks is significant and a good example of something.
Right, yeah, because part of her arsenal of quotes. Like, in fact, if you look through her, we have her 4 volumes of her letters here edited by Barbara Reynolds. And so if you look in the index, Lewis Carroll shows up a lot. Yeah. But he's almost always as quote from Alice in Wonderland or echo of Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass, or somebody says, oh, fraptious day, Callooh, Calais. Like, it's that sort of reference from Sayers. And so anyway, in The Queen's Square, that's a fun story because it is literally like a puzzle. Right? Yes. Right. It's one of those stories that's like a puzzle. So there are some stories, I think Sayers herself points this out, there are some stories that she writes for Peter Wimsey that are puzzle types and others that are more character building.
Yeah, for sure. This one is definitely an example of a puzzle type.
Right. It's just short story. Like it's very based on, there's literally a diagram in the story of the palace where they are. So I'd say like her other writings such as 5 Red Herrings. What was the other one you mentioned?
I believe Half His Carcass. There's something in there with like a puzzle that's pretty substantial part of the story. Yeah.
So anytime there's like a timetable or a puzzle, or like literally she has a short story with a crossword puzzle in the pool.
Yes.
So and then there's puzzles. And then there's Gaudy Night or 9 Tailors, which there's puzzle elements in there, but they're a lot more character driven
for sure. Yeah.
But Lewis Carroll himself liked puzzles. Like he actually invented a puzzle. I don't remember much about it, but he did invent one. And so let's talk a little bit about, and I'm going to give you guys a brief intro on who Lewis Carroll is. You are undoubtedly already familiar with Alice in Wonderland, but just a really brief bio and some data here. So he was born Charles Lutwidge Dodson in 1832, and he died in 1898. The genre he wrote has been dubbed, or he invented. I don't remember what the verb is, but it's literary nonsense. And if you think about the poem Jabberwocky, which is embedded in, I think, Through the Looking Glass, there's not even English words. It's a "'twas brillig in the slithy toves, did gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy where the morrow groves, and the malm raz outgrave." So, like, maybe the prepositions are English, but everything else is sheer made up words, sheer whimsy, right?
Sheer whimsy,
right?
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking in my mind that I really want to preach this point that every time I say whimsy, I'm not making a reference to Peter Wimsey. Like, this is not a pun. This is just, It's just whimsy. It's a perfectly good word.
Two completely separate words.
Completely. One has an H
yes.
and an E, and the other one has an E. Enough. Okay, so whimsy is a different thing than Peter Wimsey. So anyway, regarding Lewis Carroll, there have been, look, let's all be honest. In our post-Beatles era, if I present to you a piece of artwork or music that is lots of psychedelic colors or purples and yellows and talking elephants and then flying elephants and things like that, you're going to think, I think there's some drugs involved here. So Lewis Carroll has not escaped this accusation as well, that Alice in Wonderland is so strange and his other works are so strange. He must have been on drugs. Well, there doesn't seem to be much evidence for that. On my very short research, there doesn't seem to be much evidence for him being these things being drug related. So you know a little bit about why he wrote these or what he was writing them for. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So going off of the point of writing something that's really fantastical, he was a friend of George MacDonald, who is a Scottish author and theologian. George MacDonald also wrote fairy stories, which are very fantastical and at times seem like some weird, like trippy dreamscape.
And I don't think anybody accuses George MacDonald of drug use, do they?
No,
okay.
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see that friendship there. I could kind of see how like they like similar things and similar elements of their writing in that. So Carroll knew George MacDonald as well as MacDonald's children. And so part of the reason the Alice books ever made it like into a finished state is because the MacDonald family was like a huge encouragement to Carroll about completing the stories. He read like drafts to MacDonald's children and it was a great friendship.
Which is a really charming story. Like, and that seems so much better and more wholesome than I'm on opium and I'm writing about white rabbits running around. And by the way, that's Jefferson Airplane reference. So I think it's partly Jefferson Airplane's fault that Lewis Carroll is associated with drug use. So, okay. So back to Sayers. Let's talk a little bit more about Sayers' influence on or relationship to Lewis Carroll. She never spoke to Lewis Carroll. Like she didn't, like they lived in Oxford at the same time. And we're going to talk, I've got a quote for that. But Selah here has a comment from Barbara Reynolds on their living in a kind of a close proximity in Oxford when Sayers was really young. So can you tell us about that?
Yes, this is from Barbara Reynolds' biography of Sayers. She wrote, and yet she told friends that he had seen her in her perambulator.
Yeah. So it's like this family legend or something. I think there's another reference still somewhere, but like Reynolds mentions that, and Reynolds in a footnote to My Edwardian Childhood says the same thing.
Yes.
That Sayers mentioned maybe, just maybe, when little Sayers was being pushed around the Oxford Square, a square in Oxford, that Lewis Carroll may have looked into her pram. Yeah. And thus ensuring literary greatness.
Yep.
For her.
Yeah, that's all it takes.
Yeah. Just have Lewis Carroll look in your crib.
Yeah.
But Sayers is, it's a cute story that may or may not be true, but worth sharing. So I get a reference here from Sayers as well. This is also from My Edwardian Childhood, which, by the way, it would take a while for it to get to you, but if you are interested in Sayers' words about her own childhood, you can buy this online from the Dorothy L. Sayers Society. It's published by the Dorothy L. Sayers Society. And it's got, the volume itself has her own memoirs and then like a fictional retelling of her memoirs called Katamari. And probably going to have another podcast about that at some point. But it's a cool little volume. Anyway, so she's talking about her young days, and she says this. Of the stories that came in books, I loved Grimm's fairy tales and Robinson Crusoe and Alice. It was my father's task to read and explain the Alice books, and the fact that I remember these books being fetched from the boys' library thus enables me to date my first acquaintance with the meaning of a pun, though the philosophical beauties of the looking-glass world were not fully clear to me till a very late period. The sheer gorgeousness of Jabberwocky as a sequence of entrancing sounds was early revealed to me, and indeed many things that I could only dimly understand were delightful by reason of rhyme and rhythm. Lewis Carroll was living in Tom Quad, but I never saw him. This is kind of a reference to the same childhood area. I do not think my parents were ever personally acquainted with him. So one of the things I want to point out about this passage from Sayers is she says the sheer gorgeousness of Jabberwocky. Mm-hmm. And have you encountered like what she says about words that kids don't understand? Have you encountered that in her?
No, I'm not sure what you're referencing.
So it kind of scatters throughout her work, and especially when she's writing A Man Born to Be King and getting it published with the Children's Hour and her interactions with the BBC, there was some pushback from the people at BBC saying the kids aren't going to understand some of these words. And she comes back with basically, who cares? Kids don't need to understand what a word means in order to appreciate it. And she has these comments about, just enjoying the word transubstantiation. Sounds super impressive, even if a child doesn't know what it means. And in fact, like it really helps maybe that they don't sometimes. It's that they can appreciate the beauty of a language without comprehending it. Mm-hmm. And so this is just another aspect of that where she says the sheer gorgeousness of Jabberwocky.
Right. And the rhyme and rhythm aspect as well as the not understanding the words. Yeah.
Exactly. So she doesn't, and you can't understand the words of Jabberwocky.
No, because they're all made up.
Right. So we've got other references from Sayers. So we've got the Red Queen. We've got, do you have any other references that you're thinking of when you are thinking of Sayers and Lewis Carroll?
Well, I was recently reading in the collection of essays dedicated to Charles Williams. After Charles Williams passed, Sayers wrote an essay on Dante, actually, and there's a couple paragraphs in there where she references Carroll, just like by quoting, kind of like we were seeing throughout mm-hmm. the letters and stuff. And I thought it was interesting because that's not really a place I would expect to find it.
No, in reference to essays for Charles Williams,
how would that possibly come up in an essay about Dante?
Right, and that's good. I want to make a note. I want to have like an injunction here for our readers regarding commonplace quotes. So we're going to have a little educational moment here at the end. I'm a teacher, so, we'll do a little bit of that. But I've got another reference here from Barbara. It's a letter to Barbara Reynolds in February 1956. Actually, a couple of letters from 1956, which is a year before Sayers passed away. So she says, I think she's got this debate. This is not related to Carroll, but she's got this debate about how to translate the French word hose in Song of Roland. And like, is it like a pocket, or is it like pants, or is it like boots, or like she's really into the medieval weeds here on but she is translating Song of Roland for Penguin Press. So she's got to be so she's kind of wrestling with that. And she says, and in the middle of that, she's making fun of one translation that says it doesn't really make any sense. And she says, it's like the White Knight in Through the Looking Glass, beyond a doubt. I always suspect Carroll of having a pretty thorough knowledge of medieval epic and romance. So that's kind of fun. Like, that's a great compliment from Sayers.
Yeah, especially Sayers loved medieval, and obviously she's translating Song of Roland, so
exactly.
She would know.
She would know that he had, she thinks that, not all the time, but one of the things Sayers and Williams and Lewis model is thinking well of authors.
Yes, that is so true.
They are happy to compliment an author. They don't go for the jugular unless they sense sheer incompetence. They're happy to compliment authors. They can have literary heroes. Anyway, another one, this is just kind of a random little reference, again to Barbara Reynolds, again from 1956. She says, "Oh dear, how disconcerting children can be. And one never knows for certain whether these sudden profundities arise from the recollection, conscious or unconscious, of something they have read, e.g. the Red King in Through the Looking Glass." So this is just like a side, I don't remember what the Red King did in Through the Looking Glass. Do you?
I don't
have
either,
no idea either.
She clearly knows the story really well, though.
Yes, she's definitely drawing from it. So I guess what I would like to ask now is, so Alice in Wonderland, children's story. Look Through the Looking Glass, children's story. Jabberwocky, part of it, children's. Sayers wrote Even the Parrot, sort of a children's story. So what are your thoughts, Selah, on Sayers writing for children, and B, maybe how that may intersect or not intersect with Lewis Carroll's work?
So it's interesting that we just thought so much and talked about Even the Parrot, because that's very, not necessarily out of place, but that's the only one of her works that's remotely like that. Like, she's got a ton of essays, ton of detective novels, etc. And then you have Even the Parrot, which is very satirical and bizarre. So that one is, I think, by far, like, obviously, like, Through the Looking Glass or Alice in Wonderland, and that it's satire. The adult characters are saying things to the children that you think, like, that sounds like absolute nonsense. Like there's weird things with, like, logic, and the morals of the stories don't always make sense. So there's a lot of parallels there for sure with Alice in Wonderland,
which would tie in with the sheer gorgeousness of words,
for sure.
Right. So just like writing for just the beauty of the words. You don't always have to have, and she has a point, but you don't always have to have a point.
Right. Yeah. Well, and she talks about, too, in that quote where she talks about gorgeousness of words, also loving rhyme and rhythm, which, I mean, she was very dedicated to keeping Terzarima and Dante and all of that. So you can definitely see a lot of the things she's appreciating in his and Carroll's stories showing up throughout her later works.
So one of the things that, I do think her awareness of Carroll makes me think, she herself protested that she didn't like kids very much, or I don't remember where she said it, but that she didn't. And she tried to be she was a teacher. I don't think she tried that hard to be a teacher, but she was a teacher. Like, it makes me think, like, maybe there's more to her and kids than I think, than she herself says. Like, maybe she actually liked kids a little bit better than she lets on.
Yeah, well, she was like the god. She had some close relationship with Barbara Reynolds' children, too.
Right.
So it doesn't seem like she could have been that.
Right. The lady does protest too much. Yeah. Right. Yeah. In fact, that letter that I read that had a reference to the Red King, that is Barbara Reynolds. Like, she is talking about questions that Barbara Reynolds' children asked. Right. And she sent them copies of Narnia and things like that. I think she was probably a pretty cool godmother, to be honest.
So what do you think about, obviously Carroll has influence on Sayers, but how is that different than other authors that have had influence on her, like Williams, Dante, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's harder to tell the influence with Lewis Carroll, because she's just so, it's like so in her, it's so embodied in her, a lot of her writing. So she doesn't talk about it that much in a way. She references a lot of it. And if you look through her letters, there's all of these footnotes and things about it. But they just say things such as, this is an echo of Carroll. This is reminiscent of a Carroll quote. So it's just like her writing is peppered with it. But she doesn't, whereas Charles Williams, Charles Williams was alive, so she could write to him. But she will say, I owe this to Charles Williams. I owe this to like Jack Lewis for pointing this out. So she was much more obvious about their influence on her. And I didn't see that much in her writings about Lewis Carroll. That she's... Yeah,
you definitely, I would think, have to look harder to find it.
Right. And it's more of a given, maybe, that he influenced her. And also, because he was popular even in his own day. And so by the time he passed away, he was an insanely popular writer. So maybe it would be me asking you, so tell me about Dickens in your life. You're like, well, I've read Dickens. Like, I quote Dickens. You just have that influence. And you don't really point blank address it all that often, maybe?
I think it's harder because I think it's easier to vocalize whenever you're older, and she encountered Williams and Dante and all of that when she was older, so obviously she can then go and write about it. Whereas whenever this was having its most potent impact, it sounds like she was really little, and she's not going to go and write an essay then, obviously.
Right. And it captured her imagination, as many things did, and that's kind of a different influence than something capturing your intellect. Maybe.
Yeah, well, I think that's totally fair. I mean, I don't think Carroll's really writing to make, like, Dante's writing to make profound points. I think Carroll's Carroll's doing something really wonderful.
Right.
And Sayers can see that in his story and how well it's crafted, but it's not profound on the same way.
It's not
for sure.
systematic.
Yes.
Yeah, and there is something about Dante's systematic way of approaching it that appeals to Sayers.
Yeah.
And one of the things I kind of wonder about too is, my first thought is, Sayers loved Lewis Carroll. She loved his work. She didn't write like him. And then I think, well, maybe she did write like him, and then maybe he didn't. So, like, when you've read Lewis Carroll, some parts of it you're familiar with?
Yes, I'm familiar with Jabberwocky and the Alice stories, but it's been a while. So
okay. And obviously you've read a ton of Sayers. So would you say they're similar, how similar or different would you say in the writing styles?
I mean, you're like, under no circumstances would you read the Dogma as the drama and think, oh, this is like Jabberwocky.
Yeah, exactly.
So, super different styles. I mean, they're both like witty and funny and intentional with their words. So I think you could say that that's a similarity that they hold, but like, you're never going to read Sayers and think this sounds like Lewis Carroll.
Right. And she doesn't do much fantasy, like genre-wise.
Except perhaps even the Parrot.
Except for in the Parrot, which is like satirical fantasy.
Yes.
And in her letters, she kind of does fantasy. So she gives her pigs names, and she talks, and her cats.
Yes, she has a little bit of this, like the sense of humor that you could kind of see, being similar to Carroll.
Right. So, and I found this line. This is actually just stolen from Wikipedia, but one of the lines from a Lewis Carroll book is, the chief difficulty Alice found was in managing her flamingo. And you just think, Sayers totally could have written that line.
Totally.
Yeah, and would have loved to have written it first, probably, if she had thought about it. So you can see the quality of writing, and when you read Alice in Wonderland, just the wisdom of the wordplay, and there is a lot of intellectual depth, even if there's not intellectual, like, I don't know the word, but organization. That you can see that as just a sheer joy of words, again, that they both share. Okay, so I want to point out, just this is my teacher moment before we wrap this thing up. One of the things that's so awesome about Sayers' letters is her own writing, but also how she incorporates the writing of others. And not just her letters, but Peter Wimsey. So Peter Wimsey, I think a couple of times says, "Oh, fraptious day, Callooh, Calais," or, "It is my Beamish boy." And she is, she's got a storehouse of quotations in her head to come out. So Selah, you're a student, you're one of my students. So at our school, we have a practice that helps you get a storehouse of quotations. This is not an advertisement for Trinity Classical School. However, love that school. So I want to say how awesome it is in Houston. Tell us what our school does to kind of get some quotations in your head. And there's probably lots of ones, but there's one I'm thinking of.
Yeah. So Commonplace, we have something called a Commonplace book, where as we're doing our readings for humanities class, we're assigned to pick a quote out of the reading that we like and write it down, or something that was thought-provoking. Sometimes, if you're reading Crime and Punishment, maybe it's hard to say, I like this quote, but it's thought-provoking. It's worth thinking about. So you pick it and you write it, and you have a Commonplace book full of these quotes.
And then you can kind of go back, and there's an organization for it that you have, like an index for, this is a good line about sin,
you write down
or
the
this is a
page
good
number,
line.
the theme, etc. So it's easy to go back and see.
Right. So it's I've started keeping one of those a couple years ago, and it was very useful for Sayers quotations and other literature. And so I don't know the Sayers commonplace quotation book is not a new term. Sayers, I don't think, ever mentions it, but she seems to have just wonderful memory for quotations and a wonderful research skill also.
Well, Peter Wimsey also has a wonderful memory for quotations. So
exactly, it's Exhibit A. It's Peter Wimsey. One of these days, we're going to do a podcast on Peter Wimsey. I've been resisting it, but we might bow to public appeal of Peter Wimsey someday. But I think that's it for now. Well, that's it for now. I've included a questionnaire in this podcast episode for you to include one of your favorite Lewis Carroll quotations. If you have one, type it in, tell us where it's from. Together, we can build a community of memorable lines. And if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, please email me at DorothyLSayersPodcast, all lowercase, @gmail.com. That's our new email, DorothyLSayersPodcast @gmail.com. God bless you.